morning, and thank you all for coming today, and thanks to Jeff for inviting me to speak. Can I just check that everyone can hear me? Great. We've called this presentation today Rethinking Risk in a Public Sector Organisation, and I'll tell you more towards the end why I've suggested that we're rethinking risk on this basis. A little bit just about me. I work in MK Business Psychology in Glasgow, and we're a team of 6 business psychologists. And we specialise in assessment, development and career work. As Jeff mentioned, I trained in the risk type compass early days in the summer of 2014. And I've been using it for the last 5 years in various projects for individual selection, career development, team development. We've actually done some training using the risk type compass to raise risk awareness in organisations and for organisational development, which I'll talk about a bit as part of this discussion this morning. So in terms of what we're going to discuss, I'll talk about 2 or 3 different projects as we go through. The main focus will be on the Registers of Scotland. I've worked with the registers for the last 5 years in various different guises, and mainly to do with assessment and selection, and I've also helped to write their competency framework. So I've got to know the organisation very well. I was invited to start the risk type work by Jim, who's going to share this presentation with me and go deeper into the actual project itself, but I'll give you some overview of that today. I'll talk about other uses that I've made of the risk type compass, and I'll also talk about benefits of the risk type compass from an individual perspective, as somebody who's using it as a practitioner, the benefits for individuals themselves and for teams, and the benefits organisationally, thinking about the risk landscape tool that's available as part of the risk type compass collection as well. So the first use I made of the risk type compass was very soon after I'd done my training, actually, early 2015. The first big project was with a team of consulting engineers, and they asked us to get involved because they had some fatalities, unfortunately, on some of their sites, and some very high risk and dangerous behaviour had been reported. So that involved then individual profiling with 32 site supervisors, project managers and managers, and I conducted feedback with all 32 individuals. The finding was that this group, the managers, the project managers, and the site supervisors were all typically highly prudent and deliberate individuals. So in some senses, the problems on site weren't theirs, or were they? That was really the dilemma here. So when we presented back to the board our findings, we conducted a SWOT analysis, which was based on the outcomes of the risk type compass. And what we found was that those individuals who were running the organisation effectively on the ground, the operational managers, because they were so highly prudent and deliberate, they were perceived to be detached from operations. There was a lot of sort of rule book type management going on, and policy and procedure was being advocated to the workforce rather than a visibility and a presence amongst those people. So that was a really interesting finding. We also discovered that there was issues with change management and inflexibility. So one of the key actions then was we discovered that the project managers themselves were more axial leaning than some of the more technical engineering background individuals. So they became the facilitators on site. So they were the people who were effectively translating some of the issues to the workforce, rather than the people who were the health and safety experts or the technical engineers. And that started to make some differences around about behavioural safety on site. So that was my first exploration into the risk type compass, and it was kind of in at the deep end, I think, because it was a really interesting project, but very deep ramifications for the organisation. So moving on to the Registers of Scotland, Jeff's quite right, they've been around for 400 years. They're a non-ministerial department of the Scottish Government, and they register all the land and property in Scotland, and that's their function. There's 20 different registers that exist but the most popular registers are the Land Register and the Sassoons Register. But these registers used to be housed in Edinburgh Castle. So we're going back a very long way and a very deep and conscientious history that this organisation has. So I've worked there since 2013, and I know the organisation and the culture of that organisation well. So one of the things that McAdam King does, the organisation that I work for, is to deliver assessment centres and associated services to the registers. So I was involved in writing their competency framework as well, which also deepened my understanding of the organisation, because I ran a number of focus groups, etc., to get the data to help me with that project. So I've found them to be a highly compliant, reliable and stable workforce, maybe as you would expect in the public sector, and doing what they do with people's legal and land titles. Assessment work, though, has revealed a lack of big picture thinking, a lack of change orientation. Interestingly, risk awareness. It's almost like they're so comfortable doing what they do that risk doesn't come up very much when we assess individuals. And risk-taking. So they're not a particularly risk-taking organisation. But I will say my colleague Jim here is the exception, Jim not being of the typical type to be found within the Land Registry. So in 2016, the Information Governance area, which is the area that Jim looks after, we're doing some recruitment, and Jim asked me, is there anything that you know out there that helps to measure preference for risk-taking? And I said, well, actually, as it happens, yes, I do. And that's when the risk type compass was introduced to Jim and to his team. So initially as part of a selection project. But Jim decided that the risk function needed to change in line with the way that the organisation was moving, and wanted to move his function, particularly from a policing function to a consultancy function, and all that that entails. So we then got involved in profiling all the individuals in Jim's team and ran individual feedback sessions for them, and then group sessions, and then we did some separate sessions with the managers as well. So that was really quite a deep dive into one particular function. And then from there, Jim's boss became interested, who's the head of corporate services, and thought that this would be a really interesting tool to use with the board and some of the board decisions that were taken. So we started to profile the board and associated groups in 2018. And then following that, the top tier of senior managers, of which Jim is part, they also completed the risk type compass. So I did all the individual feedback with those individuals, and Jim has since run some team sessions and group sessions with them. So when we looked at the EMTs, the executive management team, so they are the core of the board, if you like. When we looked at those individuals, the risk influence graph that you can see here shows that carefree and composed was a very high predominating feature of those individuals, which is interesting given where they are trying to take the organisation. So it's an enormously traditional organisation, but they have high agenda items led by the Scottish Government to digitise the land registry and also to complete the land register by 2024. And completing a land register is by no means a simple task. You know, you would think that all the land in the geography of a country would be accounted for, but it's not. You know, there's little strips of land here, there and everywhere that nobody actually knows who owns, and tracts of farmlands and crofts in Scotland that are extremely difficult to pin down ownership. So they've got some really big, audacious objectives to actually complete as an organisation. So where the EMT is positioned, you might think is ideal for that. You know, that's a very strategic place, a change-orientated place, but the challenge, I guess, is to take the organisation with them. So this work then led to the creation of a basic risk landscape. So this is something else that the risk type compass can do. It can create a landscape. So you can take an individual, you can take a team, you can take a department, and then you can look at a whole organisation using the risk type compass. So we have the start of a risk landscape here with the Registers of Scotland. So you can see On the right-hand side, this is Jim's function, so the enterprise risk group here. And on the other side here, we have the board members. So the more green that you can see in the illustration, the more risk-averse people are, and the pinker, more red illustrations are people who are more risk-taking. So within the board and the EMT, you have a lot more risk-taking. Within Jim's team, you can see the risk enterprise people and the information governance people, as you might hope and expect, are the much more risk-averse individuals. But this risk landscape gives lots of potential for looking at organisations. So it could be that you could take some individuals who are highly compliant and not risk-taking at all and implant them into other teams and see what happens. It does give you scope to move people around and to rejig teams and to rejig functions using some of the risk type data. So that's a really interesting development. The last project I've done with the registers has been with a learning and development group. So these people are recently promoted supervisors. And I mentioned that one of our assessment centre findings is that people are not particularly risk aware. So although they're risk averse, they're not particularly risk aware. So the risk type compass was suggested as a tool to include in the training programme for these newly promoted supervisors, and to find out what that group looked like and how the risk type compass might help them in their development. So when the group was profiled, you can see on the left-hand side here that the centre of gravity came out in the prudent area. And when we look at the group as a whole, at the group influence, you can see it's highly deliberately influenced. There's people in the prudent sector, in the wary sector, the intense, and in the axis. But there's also a dearth of people in some of the other areas. So on the training, I used this as a bit of a challenge to the group, to say to them, in terms of the bits that are missing, what does that say to you about your group? How do you compensate as a group for the bits that are missing? So as you go through your training, it might be interesting to step back and to say, well, how would an excitable or a carefree or an adventurous person tackle this particular piece of work? Because they're in danger of thinking as one type as they go through their training and up through the organisation. So that's the most recent stuff. That's a bit of an overview of the registers. And as I say, Jim will go into a bit more detail when he comes up to speak. So some other uses. I have used it in recruitment for several clients, including national sales jobs. And in the national sales jobs, most of the successful applicants came through in the carefree category, again, as you might expect, because these people are flexible, they're spontaneous, ambitious, opportunistic, so very suited to sales jobs, and with an explosives manufacturer, so hence our friend up here. I'll have to look up my notes to give you the job title because it's worth knowing, actually. So the person that was recruited first was called the High Explosives Production Manager, and this company literally make rocket fuel. So it was a very, very interesting excursion into what they do. But since then, we've also used it for the selection of health and safety individuals, very much as Johan was describing. There is a type that they are looking for in health and safety and in the general production environment. It's certainly not in the carefree and adventurous zone. So I'm just going to talk about benefits finally. So in terms of the organisation, I think it does help organisations understand that they are working with a range of different types. They are not all like them at senior management level. So when I presented the findings of the senior managers, the EMT, who were all congregated at the bottom of the compass, the big point of discussion was, how do we translate our strategic objectives to the people that we probably suspect sit in that lower half of the wheel? How do we get them to follow our agenda and understand what we're about as an organisation? So there's a huge element there of communication. So understanding where you sit helps you to communicate with people who sit in a different place in the risk type compass. It's also a facilitator of organisational change, and to understand where the sticky bits are, where the resistance might be, and how you might communicate the benefits of that change and how you can take people with you. And this idea of rethinking risk, I think it helps organisations understand that risk isn't about the rule book. It's not about the standards that you set and the policies and procedures. A lot of the risk resides in the individual. So to go back to the company that I mentioned, the consulting engineers, some of the people I profiled who were the prudent and deliberate type, they just simply could not understand how people of a different type could be having these accidents on site. So somebody said to me, how could somebody possibly have reversed a forklift truck backwards down a manhole? How does that happen? Because they're sitting in a prudent and deliberate place that doesn't actually accommodate that kind of thinking at all. So that's been really interesting for me, this idea of rethinking risk and what it means for individuals and organisations. So in terms of self and others, Jeff talks about Team Homo sapiens and this wide distribution of risk type that we can see throughout the compass. I think that really is illustrated extremely well by the risk type compass and very visually as well. The risk type compass helps us appreciate as individuals the upsides and downsides of our own type. It's not that there's anything that's perfect about any one risk type. There are definitely pros and cons. And in terms of personal development, I've had some really interesting feedback, and 2 or 3 individuals have said to me that it's the most interesting and pertinent individual feedback that they've ever had. One person of the intense type who was a very strong example of that type, and one person of the carefree who was also a very strong example of that type. And some of the descriptions are quite, they're very straight descriptions of those types, and you might think people might balk from being described in those ways, but I think if you embrace those characteristics, the risk type feedback really resonates with you, and you understand exactly what it's measuring. And again, for individuals, I think it helps them rethink risk. It's not that the risks are out there to be managed. Some of the risk resides in the individual. Just linking to some of what Johan mentioned in his discussion, one of the clear benefits for me has been this nuanced version of the risk type compass that's come through with the inclusion of the subscales. And I found that extremely useful in feedback in helping people understand where they sit in the overall picture and what some of the individual components are that make them who they are. So as Jeff was saying, it's not a type instrument, it's a continuum, and I think you get a lot more of that through that nuanced page. I think it's a highly reliable instrument. I am of the axial type, and I've taken the risk type compass 4 times, and if you can see the dot on the word axis, I've come out in the dot twice, and I've come out in the A twice. So over a period of 6 years, that's how much my profile has varied. And I know I'm only a case study of one, but I thought I would share that with you. I think the layered perspective is extremely useful, this idea of the individual, the team, and the organisation. You absolutely get that from the risk type compass. And I think for me, as a practitioner, it's helped me rethink risk as well as a component of personality. As Jeff was saying, it's definitely a feature of personality. It's not some subset or correlate. It's definitely, something that makes people tick as individuals. So in terms of what's next, further partnership working with PCL and the Registers of Scotland, and what we're planning to do is to take that risk landscape, the bones of what we have at the moment, and create an entire risk landscape for the organisation now that we have approval to go ahead and do so. And that's it from me, so thank you.